like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
All right, Alex Petkas, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Good. Great to be here, Jay Burden. And you?
I'm doing quite well. I'm really looking forward to speaking to you. I've been following your work kind of at a distance for a while, and then you showed up on Aaron's show, who's a friend of mine, and I really enjoyed that episode. And so I'm glad we're able to finally bring this face to face.
Yeah, likewise. I really, Aaron wanted to talk about Julian the Apostate, and I haven't been studying Julian for a while, but I spent a lot of time on him when I was a scholar, and it's just a delight to go back over the career of that strange, wonderful man. It's good to be here.
So obviously I'm familiar with who you are and what you do, but my audience might not be. So could you give kind of a short, just like kind of thumbnail sketch of who you are and what you do on the internet?
Yeah, I was a classics professor for a number of years. I went through the whole Ivy League PhD degree certification process. And so I got to see the machine from the inside very much and thought I was going to go on to an academic career. But as a classicist, I've studied especially the Greeks and the Romans of the late antique period, especially the Greek philosophers of the late antique period, like 4th century. I gradually became convinced that the leadership of the discipline of classics was determined to destroy classics, and glad about that fact, So, and there's been articles written on this. They removed the language requirement for classics majors at Princeton, my alma mater, recently, to the great embarrassment of everybody. And so I had a tenure track job, actually, and I left it in 2020 and worked some odd jobs. And now I mainly focus on the Cost of Glory podcast, which is, I basically left academia thinking that there's a better way to do this now with the internet and the tools of new media. Like you can really circumvent the gatekeepers in an exciting way. And so I started my podcast as the kind of main project for me to be able to do that. And the Cost of Glory is essentially long form biographies of Plutarch's heroes, the Greek and Roman, noble Greek and Romans from the parallel lives. And I try to stay true to the spirit of Plutarch, which is not just telling the stories, which are amazing and fun, but also getting insights into the characters of these guys and learning lessons for leadership that regular people can hopefully use and apply, or at least be inspired by. So that's the center of my work now. And I have a presence on Twitter, as you know, at Cost of Glory, where I occasionally post, threads, but audio is my main jam.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I got a classics degree, admittedly a associate's, 2-year degree. And it's interesting because I came to the exact same conclusion, right? I was lucky enough to come up through a Christian classical school. And so I was raised in connection to many of these things. And because of that, I was sort of isolated, right? I was among people who believed in it, right? Who had a genuine love for it. And, walking out, yeah, exactly. Right. You walk out into quote unquote the real world and you assume everyone has the same feeling as you do. And you realize very quickly that is not the case.
Yeah. Like the irony of people whose legacy depends on people actually caring about classics. They've poured their lives into these arcane articles that nobody reads except professional classicists. The discipline is in a free fall, and there are a lot of interesting ideological reasons for that. I've discussed this on other shows. Did an episode with Pete Quinones about the kind of takeover of the education system and the deliberate extraction of the classics from American education, and starting in the 19th century, it had to be unseated to make the way for progress. And I talk about that in this article I wrote recently. But it really it's ironic and it's infuriating, but at the same time, there is a lot of reason for hope. Things are starting to happen, grassroots things that I think are just going to, if you take out the lines, project them 10 years in the future, the Christian classical education, or the broader sort of classical revival movement is going to overtake and devour the world of institutional classics. That's my bet. And so I think we have some interesting times to look forward to.
Well, I think you're right. And from a certain perspective, right, they, the left, whatever you want to call it, really seeded that ground, right?
Mm-hmm.
First there was a very deliberate, desire to first kind of like exclude it from the public mind, to subvert it. And then once it became kind of fully subverted, just abandon it. And so you have kind of this, like, the ground is basically fallow. Look, I'm no academic, but if you've read any of the kind of secondary sources on the classics, you realize that so much of it is completely and totally incestuous, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're making the same arguments that we've been making since the 70s, citing the same authors, talking about the same, critical lenses or whatever to look at these works. And at a certain point, it's like, well, one, nobody cares, right? Outside of your club. And even within your club, like, that's not a generative thing. You're not doing anything else. And so, I had a really interesting professor. He kind of looked like Bacchus, almost, this like tiny little squat man. But he was an absolute inveterate leftist, right? Like, at the Ivies in the kind of the heyday of, the new left in the 60s, and never really left that. And, he and I, as you can imagine, didn't get along super well, right? We were not, very compatible. But I wish I would have asked him this, which is, I was just like, well, if you hate all of this so much, why have you devoted your life to it? Right? You hate these people. And it's a question that I've really never gotten the answer to. I'm curious, do you have a thought to that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think at least two factors are at play. One is, so there's this odd disconnect when a classicist goes through a PhD program, especially at like an Ivy League place. They have this sense that the discipline used to be the pinnacle of the humanities. And they also have this sense, especially if they or their students have been through the kind of upper East Coast private school, system, that, classics are so prestigious and this is a thing for the elite, and it's very like high cultural cachet. And, I grew up in Houston, Texas, and that cachet did not, it dries up before it gets out to the hollers and the flyover states. Like, nobody knows and nobody cares. That's the environment I grew up in. And so, they have this sense of like, that they have the high ground still, which I think is false. The other thing is like, the takeover of classics ideologically has happened to a large extent through literary scholarship and literary interpretation, and kind of in a way that was pioneered by, queering Shakespeare in the 60s, and this kind of stuff. Like with fictional authors, you can always kind of make some twisted argument that, they're subverting the power structures, and they're showcasing, the subaltern voices, and you can kind of get this this reading that, Virgil's gay and he's trying to gay the I don't know. There's all kinds of ways that you can justify things by interpreting myth, against the grain, and so I think a lot of classicists will tell themselves that the authors that they really love and they really study, like Ovid and Euripides, that, they're on our side, they're our guys, which I don't think is true at all. And they're also, I think not the greatest authors in the classical tradition anyway. But the Ovid's great in his own way. I'm not. It's not my cup of tea. But Propertius, I mean, the Latin love poets. I just fall asleep reading that stuff. But
they're also
there's
a
some good
lot
stuff.
racier than
Yeah.
than most people will tell you. Catullus in particular is I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a bit much for me.
Catullus is an interesting example because like when you read about the secondary scholarship about Catullus, you get the sense that there's this sort of bisexual, libertine, pervy culture, this sort of beneath the crust of the hard Roman elites, there's all these sexual deviants. But like anytime Catullus actually mentions like gay sex, he's talking about a man raping another man to like shame him and he's joking. He's like, it's like locker room humor, like this the guy who killed bin Laden talking about making his Sisson kid his concubine. It's like, it's that kind of stuff. It's not, they're not gay, there's just so many ways to reinterpret the thing. And I think that's the version of the Greeks and Romans that they want to showcase. Oh, they're not all patriarchal, but even so, it's a distraction, and it's frankly boring, and it drives away ambitious young men, which is one of the reasons I just got sick of it. Like, and it was so, for me, the classics became a sort of surrogate guide to manliness in a lot of ways, like learning how to be right and be moral and be strong and all this stuff. They were a guide for me, and I was really indignant at the fact that we're driving away young men that could really use this stuff to make themselves better and stronger and more successful. So yeah, a lot needs to change.
So you sent me an article you wrote, which was quite good in the American Mind, and it has somewhat of a controversial title. I'm guessing that was a deliberate choice on your part. So do you want to introduce that article, and then also what sort of inspired you to write it?
Yeah, it's called "Great Books is for Losers," and I wrote this article and I posted on Twitter earlier this week, and got a lot of really emotional responses. A lot of people were really pissed off. Many of them didn't actually read the article, or they didn't read it very carefully, or they were so triggered that they weren't able to kind of read clearly what I was saying. I think, but essentially, I've been paying a lot of attention to the kind of paraclassics classical education world. If classics proper is sort of the PhD granting in classics proper, you're studying the Greeks and Romans as such. There's this whole other world of sort of demi-classics where things like Dostoevsky or Dickens can be called classics, or Dante. And there's a kind of a world of great books, which is what I was attacking in particular. And, I'm not saying that the article is basically trying to argue that this whole idea that the great books and the classics are the same thing is very questionable, and it's actually very modern. And so I just summarize some scholars that have really cataloged the history of the great books movement, and also the decline of classics proper, to wit, the study of Greeks and Romans in particular, and how these disciplines, or these ways of approaching education, are quite different in their assumptions, and arguing basically we need to get back to like the real classics, not because it's old, but because it has like stronger principles for I think what people on the right actually want, whereas the great books project is kind of a cope or a stopgap. And maybe we can get into the details a little more, but needless to say, a lot of the Christian classics world is very great books friendly, very discussion friendly, and they were quite triggered by it.
So yeah, let's get into that. So my primary familiarity with the great books is that as a teenager, I toured St. John's College in Maryland. And to be honest, on paper, it sounded perfect, right? It matched up with my interests. It was a beautiful campus. And then I went there, and everyone who went there was weird and a loser. And that's not a great reason to avoid going to a college, but it was mine. And
you did the physiognomy check.
Pretty much, yeah. And as an aside, when I went there, my main concern was it seemed like the majority of people are here not because they are passionate about the subject material, but because it was seen as an escape from something else, right? These were it was the island of misfit toys. But that program is notable for being great books based, right? It's almost entirely discussion based. There's a kind of an alternative grading scheme. So I'm curious, right? When we talk about this term, the great books, what exactly do we mean? I mean, I know what we mean colloquially, but very specifically, what does that refer to?
Yeah. Well, I want to give a brief placeholder for classics to contrast it with great books. So what I would call classics proper as the way the founding fathers of the US understood it, or the Renaissance humanists understood it. We can call it the Renaissance humanist model of classics. It's the intensive study of the Greeks and the greatest Greeks and Romans and their writings, with an eye to mastery of language through emulation, learning to write and speak like them, and improvement of character, learning to kind of be like them, to aspire to that model of greatness or virtue. Great books is a movement that started in the early 20th century at Columbia College or Columbia University. I can't remember which it was back then, but so essentially, and it spread to University of Chicago. Mortimer Adler was a big figure there, and St. John's adopted their great books curriculum only in, was it 1931, something around there. It's in the article. But the idea is instead of doing the whole Greek and Roman thing, which you could also call the rhetoric model of classical education, you pick this set of texts that are, for various criteria, judged to be the most important books that you can read, from not just antiquity, but like a whole, as it's often called, Plato to NATO, like monuments of the West throughout the centuries. Excuse me. So people on there would include maybe Dante, maybe Thomas Aquinas, maybe Thomas More, Milton could be on there, Shakespeare could be on there. The great books model at St. John's and that Adler really preferred was really philosophy heavy. So Kant, Hume, Descartes, Spinoza, and it could go all the way to guys like Freud and Marx. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for intellectual curiosity, and I think people should read widely and learn this stuff. But the approach that you usually take, as you saw at St. John's, and that also is quite often taken in classics, like sort of purportedly right-wing classics programs now, Christian classical schools, is sort of discussion centric. You sit around and you talk about the ideas in particular. It's a very idea first approach. And this was actually the way that there's this famous collection of the great books of the Western world that was published by Britannica. Mortimer Adler of Chicago was the kind of leading figure in assembling that collection. They winnowed down their collection of great books on the basis of ideas, justice, the sovereignty of man, whatever, metaphysics, the nature of being, and all these kind of ideas or sort of philosophical questions. And what you end up having is a very critical discussion, idea focused, and for the most part value neutral way of inculcating, well, not even inculcate, but a way of kind of going through the list. And what seems to be absent, certainly at a place like St. John's, is the sense that these guys are right, those guys are wrong. There are moral principles that you should uphold. There are moral principles that you should not uphold. You're sort of left to kind of figure that out. And the idea is very, it's very free market, I think, very liberal in the sense of like, let's examine all ideas, even bad ideas, and sort of sharpen our wits at analyzing arguments. And so that's the approach that I think is very not classical in spirit, though it might be valuable for other things. And if you look at the people that it produces, I was just talking with a very talented friend of mine a couple of weeks ago who dropped out of St. John's because he felt that what the education he was getting there produced, even though the books were great and it was fun and fascinating, the kinds of people, like most of his peers, just ended up being kind of snarky and flippant. And, oh, yes, Kant. Yeah, we read that. Check that box off. Oh, Aristotle would say that. And they were just like, there's a kind of hubris that it builds in sophomoric 20-year-olds of, it gives you this early confidence as though you've mastered these things when you've probably just barely scratched the surface. I mean, you're cramming reading all the time. By the time you finish one book, the ideas haven't even sunk in. You're on to the next. And it's sort of not the way that that a real intellectual of power masters these things in the first place. So I think there are all these problems with it, and we need to be aware of, like, even the good versions of it might not produce the results that we want.
No, I think you're right there, and this is something that my friend Athenian Stranger and I have spoken about, right? Which is the sort of like Wikipedia entry summary of a thinker. Right. Where it's like, well, Plato thought about forms and Aristotle liked slavery and thought women had pig teeth. Reducing all of these men with like these great bodies of work down to memes, effectively, like down to the kind of like most simple stripped back version of it. And on one hand, right, if you're designing a course, it's like, well, I guess I should have them read some of everything, right? Because you're kind of sifting for that talented tenth or whatever who will, dig more on their own. And, I understand that. But to me, it's in sharp contrast to how previous, even in the American tradition, forms of education were practiced, right? Where it was, well, of course, you would read greatly, but the idea was you were looking for role models, right? You would read about Caesar because you wanted to be like Caesar. This is something that you see very clearly in Thomas Carlyle, right, on Heroes and Hero Worship. Totally. And he goes through these kind of like great archetypical figures. But I mean, read through our own American founding fathers and you see that same model. I mean, a very explicit version of this is Ben Franklin, who's, shall we say, a mixed bag. He's kind of an odd duck, to put it mildly. But he had a method for teaching young children how to write, which is actually how I was taught to write, which is basically, you take a famous oration, a famous, paragraph, whatever, have, the class copy it, kind of bring it back down to a very stripped back format, turn it into, an outline almost, and then build it back up, right? You're taking something apart, you're pulling it like into its components. And then in that, you understand as much as you can at that age, everything about it, and then you have to copy it. Right. And so that's a very practical way that you were taking someone who was a great orator and making yourself like them. And the phrase from Carlyle, right, hero worship, I mean, that's actually quite an apt phrase, right? You were sort of devoting yourself to being like something else. And I think that older model is, I mean, it's certainly much less discussion based, right? It is, I guess, more hierarchical way. But one, do you think I've accurately kind of characterized that pre-existing classic model? And two, what do you think that offers us that the current approach doesn't?
I think you characterize it well. Well, I characterize it in the article as a distinction between a canon of great books versus a canon of great men, and education with the latter being the traditional way, the classical way, which is how the Greeks and Romans did it. It's how the Renaissance guys did it, and the clearly the founders. The book part is just your medium for accessing these embodied individual examples of greatness that you're trying to be like. And you could be trying to be like them as a leader. You could be trying to be like them as a poet. You could be trying to be like them as a haranguer of armies or citizen assemblies, as a lawgiver, etc. It's really it's designed to fuel and then channel ambition of really of sort of the people who aspire to lead the citizenry. Like, this is not necessarily for the masses, just because not everybody's fit to lead. And I think you put it well, like this way that Ben Franklin would do. Somebody I know has called it copy work. It's an ancient rhetorical exercise of paraphrasis in Greek. And that's how you assimilate the style of a Sallust or a Caesar or a Demosthenes. But it's also how you assimilate the kind of nuances of their character. And it's also how so many other disciplines just intuitively, obviously structure apprenticeship. This is how painters learn to paint, right? They copy the masters, and then they develop their own style through that. It's a way that that really is the rails for creativity, developing your own repertoire, right? And there's room for discussion in a rhetorical school in antiquity or today, but it's much more. I think it's more serious. It's more kind of formalized. You're, preparing arguments and having debates with each other about ideas. You're not just like exploring the ideas. You're also practicing deploying them in persuasive situations, which is to say you're turning the ideas not just into kind of personal development or cool reflections, but into a repertoire. I think that you kind of can do that in a great books program, but it's not really optimized for that by its nature. That's not part of the principles of the thing.
So there are two things I want to get into, right? One of which you mentioned in your article, and one of which I just thought about as you were saying that, which is the abandonment of the classical languages, right? Greek and Latin. I was a passable Latin scholar 4 years ago. I'm going to be honest, absolutely shameful at Greek. It was a disaster. Past the alphabet, which I think I've still got. But nonetheless, right, that's a relatively rare thing. And in your article, you mentioned how even relatively recently, right, this was relatively recently, I guess, if we're talking about the classics, right, this was an entry requirement into the best universities in the land. And so one, I think it'd be pertinent. Why was that dropped? Why was that changed? And two, what is the value that learning the classical languages brings?
Yeah, the Ivies all used to require Greek and Latin. That was your basic entrance into Harvard or Yale up through the middle of the 19th century. The last holdouts, I think, capitulated in around 1900. But it was seen as, I think it's implicit in the structure too. It's very obviously stated by a lot of Renaissance humanists that essentially mastery of language, the specific language that the person that you're studying used, is a powerful, maybe one of the most powerful tools of mimesis. Like the Sapir-Whorfian hypothesis, learning language restructures your thoughts potentially. You can't really translate everything, and it's also like assimilating the thought patterns of the ancients is part of the game. And this is something that most classics professionals just don't really make the case for. They say something, if they're trying to argue that you should learn Latin or Greek, it's all about, passing your SATs or knowing the etymology, learning grammar. And I think that, even just, it's not necessarily about understanding the Greeks better, which not everybody's going to be into, but the strongest argument, and the reason it's really there, is because of this inappropriate to say now in polite liberal circles, this emulation of this powerful manly forcefulness that you get in Homer or Demosthenes or Cicero, these like patriarchal models that you just want to like stamp yourself with. I don't want to say spiritual, but there's a kind of like there's a very strong emulative function to that. I think they got rid of that because people stopped believing it, or it was the progress of the Enlightenment University. They wanted to make more room for the trades. I'm not so familiar with the arguments that were made at the time, but essentially this was part of the whole undoing of the, the monarchic authority or diarchic authority of Greek and Latin that progressives like Charles Eliot at Harvard or John Dewey, they just felt like they had to get rid of to make room for stuff like sociology and women's suffrage and that kind of thing.
So there's something to that, right? And you see this in Orwell, right? The idea that language controls your ability to think, right? The two are very closely linked. And there's a degree to which learning a new language sort of grants you a new mental prism, right? It literally does expand the mind. And I think that there's probably a broader discussion to be had about, quote unquote, justifying education, right? Where there's this idea that it needs to be economically justified. Well, you will earn X more dollars, you'll be, Y percentage more successful. And really that was not in a sort of right and proper understanding, that's not the purpose of an education, right? It's not nearly an economic transaction. I mean, even the idea of getting an education, right? Like that phrase kind of triggers me because it's not, right? You were cultivating a certain type of man who thinks a certain way, right? And that is a in itself a good end. And the idea that like, well, we could make more money if we took the time devoted to classics and had you sit through a tax law class. It's like, well, I don't disagree with that argument, right? You're probably correct, but I disagree with your presupposition, right? That is the purpose of a university education. One other thing that I think is relevant to this, right? And you've seen this across education as a whole, not just the classics, is an abandonment of recitation, right? Of actually memorizing something by rote. And I've noticed this because one, you kind of see this in how shocked people are when someone can just rattle something off. Like, I don't particularly like the man, but the fact that, that Boris Johnson can recite can recite Homer in almost perfect Greek. I mean, that was a news story, right? People were shocked by it. And if you read, speeches from 100 to 200 years ago, not only were those speeches in themselves committed to memory, which is impressive, but they are quoting from the classics. And, sure, you could say, well, that's just, that's boring, repetitive work. But both that and the learning of another language speaks to a certain amount of discipline that's just a very valuable skill to have. Sorry, I've thrown a lot at you, Alex. You could jump in.
Yeah. Well, and Churchill could recite long swaths of Macaulay, the Horatius at the Bridge. And a proper rhetorical training also intensively trains the memory. It's like one of the pillars of rhetoric. And so it's I think you put it well. It's like about trying to create a certain kind of person. Now, don't get me wrong, people paid a lot of money for this in antiquity and up through, but it wasn't necessarily like they're trying to guarantee that they'll make more money. It's like they want to certify or not certify. That's the wrong word. They want to make sure that they live up to the class and the kind of force of character that they plan to inhabit later in life. So, that's why it's worth it, because as a leader of society, as somebody who speaks with or can speak with anybody from the lowest to the highest, somebody who can affect your will on large numbers of people, you're going to have more access to opportunities, not specifically necessarily finance or programming. But I think that there is a really, it's smart. Like those soft skills are often what make the difference between the guy who's taking orders as an engineer and the guy who is maybe not doing the engineering, but is paid more and ordering the engineers around. I also think that classics, like the whole discussion around the humanities, suffers a lot because we tend to see it in competition with other subjects, which is really, to me, one of the most shameful things that the university system has done is like pit physics or computer science or, finance against, say, classics or even English literature, like as if those you should have to choose between those two things. Whereas, really what I think the right way of thinking about it is there's a certain kind of cultural standard we need to have for anybody like aspiring to leadership. And that's kind of what it is. It's an education in statesmanship, in how to be the leader type rather than the follower type, or the master type rather than the slave type. This is how they would have talked about it. The liberal arts is like the arts for the masters as opposed to the slaves, the liberales, the free men in a heavily slave driven economy in antiquity. So there's a lot to that. And I think this is really important too, because when you drain the sort of leadership quality out of education, when you stop stamping people like that, you end up with crappier leaders, right? Not only are the leaders themselves, the sort of managerial class of the elite, just they're not ambitious really in the way that like Plutarch's heroes are. They're kind of careerist, they're small-minded, they don't have that sense of greatness, they don't have that taste for it. And people in broader society don't necessarily know to demand better. Like you look to the guideposts of greatness from the past that have withstood the test of time in order to know what to expect of a great leader, to say, oh, this guy's really something. This guy's really special in the scope of history. And I think that this was really sort of mission accomplished for the long march of institutions that is really what we have to thank for the wokeification of education. Like, it really drains the blood out of the strong classes of society, and lets all kinds of bad ideas and bad people take hold and sort of profiteer off of this imperial system that we have. So the consequences are immense.
Well, and that's an interesting transition, right? The transition from politics as an art, right, where you were supposed to be liberally educated in grammar, rhetoric, that whole system, right? And you are supposed to model yourself on great men, and the transition between that and political science, right, where it's like you're taking an art and trying to transform it into a scientific process. And look, science is great for building bridges and sending people to Mars, but it's actually quite difficult to run a quote unquote controlled experiment in politics, right? Like, how do you actually test your hypothesis? I mean, I'm waiting for an answer there, right? And you compare that to, shall we say, a different understanding of it, where it says, well, of course, like, human nature is such, but, there are men who have succeeded, albeit in different societies than yours, and these are the attributes they had. You need to cultivate similar attributes, study how they acted in certain circumstances. And for proof, right, look at the declining quality of our leaders, right? We don't have these sort of great men anymore. And I think that, that is a very, very direct consequence of abandoning the classics, but also of abandoning, whether you want to call it virtue, something higher, anything, right? This is what Lewis talks about in his, famous essay, Right Man Without Chests, right? That start to the abolition of man, I believe. Who knows? I'll edit it in if I was wrong.
Yeah.
And he has this line where he says, you take these ideas out of a man and ask him to be brave, ask him to be ambitious. You're creating a gelding and commanding it to bear fruit. And, I think that really that is what we see when we have taken the political, chopped off its roots and stuck it back in the dirt, and we wonder why the tree is wilting.
Yeah, and this is a consequence, I think, of the German research university, the Enlightenment research university system, in a way, which is, the idea that the job of the university is to produce knowledge, to produce new knowledge, and to produce knowledge experts, to produce specialists who can be relied upon to perform whatever task you need them, as long as they have the PhD in the relevant subject, or at least the master's degree. And it's kind of founded on this principle of fungibility, like a, somebody who has a degree in, let's say, law or public finance can be relied upon more or less to do the thing that you need a guy with a degree in law or public finance to do. And it really depersonalizes politics and takes a lot of the agency out of it in a way that's very appealing to socialism, which, no surprise, socialism kind of rises as a result. It's kind of like the ideology of the intelligentsia, rule by experts. And this is, I think Nietzsche is, to his credit, he's like such a far-seeing person. He's like already seeing the sickness that this causes by the mid to late 19th century, when this system has been around for several generations in Germany. It's a hyper-educated culture, just packed with experts, all this prestige for university professors and, the baccalaureate holders. And his antidote for the pseudo education of his day, as he talks about on the uses and abuses of history, is to tell the young men, satisfy your souls on Plutarch. 100 such men educated against the grain, who have grown accustomed to the heroic and begun to believe in themselves when they believe in Plutarch's heroes, could silence now and forever the whole noisy pseudo education of our day. And I think there's that tension is very much built into the structure of the university system as we have it now. It's, something I've kind of come to appreciate through leaving. It's there to produce high conformity bureaucrats, high intelligence, employees, and not leaders anymore. It's kind of threatening to the system to encourage people to be really high agency and to admire the great monuments of the past. It's like disruptive to the whole socialist project. So I think the implications are profound.
Well, and that's another interesting point, right? The difference between, the bureaucrat and, like the great man, right? Where essentially, the bureaucrat is, a part in a machine, right? He is sort of a human who has been mechanized, right? And there's, again, no accident that we see the massive rise of bureaucracy after the Industrial Revolution, right? We see a transition from, men as actors to men as components, right? Even Burnham writes about this, where he talks about the death of the capitalist class, being replaced with managers. And I think that's a really interesting thing because, of course, as, basically, like a human spring, who does one function. We're looking at this kind of like much harder to economically justify system of classics, right? Like it doesn't bring in the money, it doesn't serve in their bounded rationality, it doesn't serve a purpose, but right, it creates a different type of man, who admittedly, they're correct, is not well suited for bureaucracy, but is very necessary to have, a functional, like beautiful civilization.
Yeah. Well put. And, it gives such people like a taste for greatness too, I think. And it goes to the kind of like I think the fundamental quality that education is really there to produce anthropologically. Like if you look at the way that early societies is one of the great things about studying the Greeks, you get this glimpse of this very early society kind of entering the age of literacy. You can already see it in the way that the Homeric poems are structured. Like the main thing that you give your kids as far as their education, your young men, of course, you're going to teach them swordsmanship. You're going to teach them how to stand in the hoplite line, to ride a war horse. But the elites or the people who aspire to leadership get this training in what they call musike, and the art of the muses, who are the daughters of Zeus and memory, power on the one hand, and then kind of the arts on the other hand. like the main content of that is memorizing and assimilating great stories about great men doing great deeds. You know, you're like you're juicing them up. You're riling them up for, you know, pirate adventures or commanding armies, or you're giving them that taste for something higher, that is actually often what it takes to go from a highly paid employee to a company founder, or, you know, a junior lawyer to a senator. Like, you have to like try to do something extra. You have to go outside the established channels and see opportunities out there. And you have to kind of dream big and have an imagination to do that. So it doesn't fit into the kind of economic calculus, strictly speaking, of, you know, your typical poli-sci statistician analysis of you know, U.S. News report on college outcomes. But if done right with the right people, I think it's electrifying. You know, as shown by what a lot of the Renaissance humanists accomplished, what the founding fathers accomplished. I mean, that took a hell of a lot of imagination to pull off the American Revolution, right? Like, they were drunk on Plutarch 24/7. Like, it was the most popular ancient texts and one of the top 5 most popular books to be, you know, likely to be on your shelf in the American colonies. And I think the results speak for themselves.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And again, this is why I like Carlyle so much, right? As he talks about that ability to basically, you know, take the heroic, right, and how that can sort of like set you on fire. And I think it's something that, you know, modernity really struggles with, is the concept of a hero, right? And you see this in a lot of modern media, right? George R. R. Martin is probably the best place to look at it, right? He cannot comprehend the concept of the heroic, right?
Mm-hmm.
He deliberately will set up, you know, someone to be heroic and then kind of twist and distort them. You know, it does not make sense. And you see this again in the way that, you know, our current elite love to look back at men from a previous generation, right? So the Napoleon movie that came out about a year ago, which I have not seen, I've been assured that it is quite bad, right? But then again, right, we see a man who, for all his faults, was certainly heroic, right? He made his will manifest across the world. And instead of focusing on that, well, really, we've got to, you know, dig into his, you know, his personal relationships, you know, kind of deliberately humiliate him. And it seems as if, right, the desire in that is basically to say, like, you're not special. You can never be special. Every one of these guys you think is cool is actually a weird, gross pervert. Yeah. And I think that type of demoralization has been very successful. And, you know, in many ways, what you see when you read authors before the 1940s, and certainly before, you know, the turn of the century, is you see a radically less cynical world, where certainly, you know, there are, you know, mixed characters, but you can, in kind of like a very genuine way, look at someone and say, that is an honorable man. That is a man I wish to embody the spirit of. And you particularly see this, you know, but it's easily apparent, you know, many of my audience will be familiar with this, in the ways that, you know, even figures like, you know, Jackson and Lee wrote about, you know, the American founding fathers. Like, they basically spent their entire lives trying and failing to live up to an admittedly mythologized portrayal of Washington, right? And you can say, well, they never did it. You know, they never did as much as he did. You know, they themselves considered that to be a failure. But at the same time, right, it's like, well, which is better? To say, you know, I want to be like my hero and I could not, or to say, you know, heroism doesn't exist, and so it's fine for me to be this kind of like, you know, horrible bug man. I feel like that's a fairly easy choice to make.
Yeah, the emotion that drives heroism for the Greeks is zelos. It's where we get the word zeal. Zeal has kind of shifted in meaning since then. But zelos is emulation. Aristotle defines it as a pain felt when a man sees present among others who are like him by nature, things good and honorable, which he himself is capable of attaining. And this is what makes you want to strive to match the achievements of your peers, or, you know, the grand sort of chain of history going, you know, Caesar weeping at the statue of Alexander because he hadn't accomplished anything worthy of note by that age. And this is, what you get with Jackson and Lee and the founding fathers. And the opposite, so there's kind of two opposites of that in the Greek mind. There's the opposite of contempt technically for Aristotle, or the opposite of zeal is contempt. Cataphronesis, looking down on something, thinking little of it. Like a great man feels contempt for, the lesser men, maybe if he's sort of hubristic. But I think that when you take that hero culture out of the equation, when you tell men don't feel like that, you're not allowed to feel like that, or anytime you feel like that, let me show you how this guy was actually a perv or petty. Like there's just a denial of even the existence of greatness that you get in pop culture and Game of Thrones, maybe, or the Napoleon movie. I mean, we're not allowed to have heroes anymore. They all have to be like mobsters or drug dealers or something. They're kind of likable, but just a reminder, these people are destructive for society, and you can't really like them unproblematically. What you get in its place is either contempt. So like that implies self-contempt, right? Like it's not even worth it. Just be a bug man, right? Eat the mealworms. Or the contrast, the kind of evil twin of zeal is what I call it, is envy, phthanos in Greek. Now, this is what Nietzsche calls ressentiment. And Aristotle says this is the feeling that you feel, that pain you feel when you see somebody else succeeding, not at the fact that you don't have it, but at the fact that they have it. And you want to like knock them down. You just want to, it would make you happy to see them, dethroned. That is ressentiment. That is the kind of like emotion of the French Revolution in Nietzsche's eyes, communism. And so these like basic human emotions really, I think, are very explanatory for like why our society is so sick now that we've demolished the whole concept of a hero. And it's relegated to kids' books, and it's kind of silly, and you can have like fake Marvel heroes that they're kind of gay anyway. And there's like, this is very much like a primary cause of the whole crisis of masculinity. I think a guy like Richard Reeves, I think he's doing some important work, but like he's just not able to really face up to that reality because it goes so counter to the left-wing narrative.
Well, and that's a very interesting point, right? Because fundamentally, the left is motivated by resentment, right? This is both spiritually and factually true, right? I recently had on a friend of mine, Aidan Paladin, who's a very gifted researcher, and she rattled off a number of studies that proved this exactly, right? I cannot remember the name of it. I'm by no means a statistician, but it was a social experiment where effectively they gave a communal pool of money, and the only condition for you to draw it out is you and your partner have to agree on how to split it. If you don't agree, no one gets it, right? And what they found is that people with a liberal bias, self-described, of course, were much more likely to accept no money so that the other person wouldn't get more than they did, right? They were willing to basically screw everyone. Whereas, people of other political persuasions were more likely to reach, they would say like, all right, well, fine, I guess I'll give you $7 and I'll take 3. It's better than nothing. Goodbye. Was, an attitude that they did not have. So that's the kind of like justification, or the like practical application of it. But fundamentally, right, if we look at the difference between the left and the right, it is equality versus hierarchy, right? It is, we are all the same, or should be made to be, in extreme examples with kind of communism, but it's the same kind of motivating force, which again is pure resentment. And, the hero is by definition hierarchical. He is someone head and shoulders above other men. And, in recognizing the heroic, there's sort of a necessary humility that comes along with that, right? That like, I am not that, and I wish to embody virtues of it. And I think that the reason these people can't write heroes is because it violates this kind of like core tenet of their being, right? It like strikes at the very root of, their belief. And, when you look at, the classics more broadly, like, sure, we can definitely talk about the heroic military figures in history. But again, right, like what is a man like Livy or Aristotle? I mean, it's basically like a hero of history, a hero of philosophy, right? This great man we all look towards. We kind of created this field. And I think that there's a similar desire to kind of tear that down, right? To make all of those things little and small and lesser. And I think that resentment you described is very close to the center of it.
Yeah, this is clearly at root in the classics crisis, the hatred of greatness. And it's one of my problems with the whole great books paradigm is like the ancient Renaissance rhetorical paradigm of classics is the structuring agent for heroism in society. This is how it happens. This is how you create that culture. This is how you produce more zeal in the youth, and channel it to productive purposes. And you can't just like give people a bunch of books and hope they figure it out on their own. Who teaches those texts matters a lot. And there's this pattern in higher ed, maybe like in secondary schools too, of the teacher comes into class and they just say, well, what did you think of the text? And I don't know. People start talking and start voicing stupid opinions, and maybe they're good opinions, but the teacher always kind of like hides what they think. And the point is to like have this Socratic elicitation of, what people think about stuff, and to kind of come gradually to some conclusion as a class. And it's just so flaccid. And, you don't have a lot of time to give people, to give young men, especially who just need so much more shaping, who can benefit so much more from shaping than I think women are going to generally figure it out. Like they're going to kind of read the room of society and match that. But like men are just wild cards in a lot of ways. And it needs a strong hand, and who that teacher is matters a lot. And them taking like a stance on things matters a lot. You gotta have something to rebel against even as a young man. So, like we've got a lot of work to do, but I think that there's like this new energy. Like people are really pissed off the past 4 years, like broader society. They're like open to new solutions for education. And, we've got at least 4 years of kind of the censors letting up on us, and it's time to build now.
Well, definitely, Alex, this was a really fun conversation, and I just looked down at the clock and realized we're at time. I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for coming on. But if people want to find more of you and more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
Yeah, costofglory.com is my website. The Cost of Glory is available on all your platforms. I'm on YouTube, started doing some documentary series on my YouTube channel. I also run retreats. If you're interested in that sort of thing, we got one coming up in January in Austin, kind of trying to reconstruct this whole model of, rhetoric, classical rhetoric as leadership training and kind of male bonding. It's a men's only retreat. So we're really committed to, reviving single gender education too, which I think is a big component of this. So yeah, I'm pretty easy to find if you just Google Alex Petkas or Cost of Glory.
Well, again, thank you so much for coming out. As far as my stuff, you can find The Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want to support us, you can obviously do that directly with the links in the description, or you can head over to our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Again, Alex, I appreciate it. And everyone at home, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.